Did you just say Covenant Spritz?
Mm-hmm.
Spraying down your mic with a little bit of Covenant.
Mm-hmm.
Last week we talked about a robust cup of Covenant. Now we're just doing light little sprinkle spritzes of Covenant.
Covenant Spritz, aka baptism.
There we go. Well, hey guys, welcome back to another episode of Born to Read. We're following up our episode from last week on the a robust cup of Covenant, just a definition and a exploration of what covenant theology is. And so this week we wanted to recommend a resource to you to help if you're new to covenant theology. A good entry level introduction to covenant theology.
Right.
The book is The Promises of God by RC Sproul, subtitled Discovering the One Who Keeps His Promises. I actually found this book after my grandparents died earlier this year. I found this book on their shelf, and I was like, I'm an RC Sproul junkie. RC Sproul was the one who introduced me to Reformed theology. I was listening to him when I was like 8 years old. Right when I was going to bed, his radio program was on. So I've always got Sproul as my homeboy. So the book was interesting. And then I looked at it, and I started looking at like the description of it, and I went, oh, this is like an explanation of what covenant theology is.
Right.
I was like, oh, I'll read through it. It probably took, this book looks thick, but it's actually a pretty
easy read.
It's a really, really easy read.
Yeah.
And he kind of just goes through what the purpose of the covenants was, what God's purpose is, and showing that God keeps his promises. What helped me specifically in this was keeping the Old Testament and the New Testament as one revelation. That it's, God's telling one overarching story, and it's not. We have a blank page in the middle of our Bibles that goes from Old Testament to New Testament, but he shows that it's all leading, and then finishes his last chapter as the Christ of the covenant, getting to this. This was all about Christ from the get-go.
Right.
So, really, really helpful.
Now, admittedly, I haven't read it, but
shame.
It's very basic, right? Yeah. And when people hear us talk, and when I say us, I mean us Reformed folk talk, they're like, oh, everything's covenant to you guys. Covenant coffee, covenant breakfast, covenant spritz. Like, you got covenant everything.
Your Sunday morning services are called covenant renewal.
Yeah.
It's covenantal baptism.
Tim's sitting here with his covenant laptop, his covenant mic.
With an apple on it.
Covenant breaking that laptop.
We're showing the necessity of the covenant of grace.
Yeah.
out of the
out of Steve Jobs' evil, malicious plans.
Yeah,
he's just really a covenant theologian.
It's probably the mark of the beast too. So, all I have to do is buy the whatever they're going to do to put it on my forehead. I've got the Apple Watch that goes on my wrist. So
as soon as they come out with it, right on the forehead.
No. The other thing I like about this book is it would be very helpful for like a small group or even just a family discussion, because every chapter, they're very short chapters, but every chapter ends with a study guide and questions. So, if you're just having a group of people sitting down, especially, if you've got a new group of people that aren't really sure about this whole covenant theology, Reformed theology thing, it would be a really helpful, you read the chapter, go through the study questions, and just be able to talk through and understand what God was doing from the covenant of redemption, or what do you call it? Do you use a different name for the covenant of redemption? There
is another name for it. I just forgot about it. The covenant of redemption.
The covenant God makes with the Father makes with the Son.
Covenant of life. It's also called the covenant of life.
It wasn't coming to me. But then you have he just goes through the Abrahamic covenant, the Noahic covenant, the Davidic covenant, and then the new covenant, and showing how Christ is intimately involved in all of it. And it's really that straightforward.
Right. And the reason he starts with the covenant of redemption, the covenant of life, is because that was an inter-triune covenant made within God before time began. Why is that important? Well, because covenant it's like everything in this world is covenantal because God is covenantal. That's how God relates to his creatures. That's how God relates to himself. So God is covenantal. It's the air we breathe. It's the way you live. If you step back and look, you're like, oh man, I have a covenant with my wife. I have a covenant with my children. I have a covenant at work. I have a covenant with my other family members. Like everything is covenantal because that is how God set up the world. So it's inescapable. You really can't get away from it. That's why he starts with the covenant of redemption and then traces all of it through scripture and shows how Christ is the substance of all of them.
Yeah. Well, I think this is where it's helpful to trace it back to give to a newbie. I don't even like using that word, newbie. But like our guest last time was Isabel, your cousin. This is the type of book that I would loan to her. Say and loan. I don't like giving books away.
Especially your grandparents' books.
My precious. But this is the type I would loan out to somebody and say, here, if you want more questions, we answer a lot of those questions there, but this would be in a typical RC Sproul type of way.
Right.
He does a good job.
He makes it digestible.
Relating.
It's very basic.
And I think one of the things that he helps with, even when he talks about the Mosaic covenant, when you're mentioning how God always relates to man in terms of covenant, is that there's often a distinction that the Mosaic covenant isn't a gracious covenant.
Yeah, it's somehow a republication of the covenant of works.
Yeah, and he does a good job in here is saying, no, it's still any covenant that God makes with man is a gracious covenant because God has no obligation to actually relate to man. And so his condescending to be in covenant with man is in itself gracious. Mm-hmm. And
so was the covenant of works gracious? Be careful. You're going to be federal vision if you don't answer this.
Oh no.
But a lot of people say the covenant of works was the covenant God made with Adam and Eve. It was initiated in grace because anytime God makes a relationship with his creatures, it's gracious.
Right.
But it was conditioned upon perfect obedience.
Right.
That's what makes the covenant of works the covenant of works. The covenant of works was a gracious covenant. The covenant with Moses, the Mosaic covenant, was a covenant of grace. Before God even gives the law, he prefaces it with grace. He says, I brought you out of the land of Egypt as on the wings of eagles. Therefore, here's the law. So it is an error to equate the Mosaic covenant with the covenant of works.
Yeah. I also found out in this book what RC Sproul's favorite Bible verse is.
Oh, really?
And I'm not finding it here, but it's the verse where he's like, if I had one book that I could have, if I'm in prison and I can only have one book of the Bible, I'm going to have Hebrews. If I could only have one chapter of the Bible, I think he says he would have like Romans 8, I want to say. And he's like, if I could only have one verse, I would choose this verse out of Genesis 15, which it's the verse of the flaming pot that comes out of heaven and passes between the cloven animal halves.
Oh, okay.
And he says, this is the verse that I would have. If I could only have one verse ever, this is the verse that I would have. Mm. And, you're reading that going, RC, have you gone nuts? That's not an important verse. And how many of us would read through the Genesis story and go, oh, whatever. You kind of take the verses following and say, oh, God's making a covenant with Abraham. Mm-hmm. But he shows this necessity of this verse sums up covenant, that this is God entering into a covenant with man and saying, Abraham, you don't get to walk through the halves, the halved animals. Yep. And I walk through it to say, if I break my covenant with you, may it be unto me as these animals. And it's God taking all of the responsibility of the covenant onto himself.
Right.
And so R.C. Sproul says that that's his favorite verse in the entire Bible. So is R.C. Sproul crazy?
No.
Not anymore.
It's still his favorite verse, probably.
It still probably is. But it was a funny little, oh, that's a surprise.
Yeah. Well, that's a great verse, though. I don't blame him.
But it's such a, and that goes back just to the testament of R.C. Sproul, to make somebody who is so studious and so observant to how God structures his revelation and understanding that on such a deep level, and then being able to make something so accessible and easy to read, and yet just very profoundly true. You know, it's not, I say it's an easy read, it's an accessible read that I would give to somebody who, is new to covenant theology, but it's not so simple that I'm like, okay, yeah, this is for a third grader. Like an adult, it was on my grandparents' shelf. Like they found benefit from it, and so I found benefit from it. I found it very helpful, even though it was very simple and accessible.
Well, great. What would you rate it?
9 out of 10.
9 out of 10, huh?
It was too short, and he didn't go.
It wasn't
as it left me wanting more. So there was enough there, but
you're subtracting a point for it not being a systematic theology.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, and some of the chapters, I got really frustrated with where he broke some of the chapters. I was like, really?
Yeah. I wonder if his editor did that.
And I think it was designed for being a discussion book. So it's like, okay, it's a short chapter with discussion questions. So this is for next week. Next time we can talk about these chapters. But they kind of interrupted the flow a little bit. But outside of that, content-wise, very helpful, and very, it's another quick reference book. Oh, how did RC Sproul put this?
Right.
When I'm lacking the words to use to describe something, I'll go back and reference some of the things that he said. So very helpful. Once again, the book is The Promises of God, Discovering the One Who Keeps His Word by RC Sproul, the late RC Sproul. Mm-hmm. Sproul's my homeboy.
Church triumphant. He's still up there.
He's still up there praising the Lord, singing holy, holy, holy.
Mm-hmm.
And we might be talking some singing here too.
Yeah,
soon.
We should.
But with that, we'll go ahead and sign off. Get this book if you're interested at all in covenant theology. Sproul is one of those most respected,
or even if you're not interested,
theologians. Yeah,
still beneficial.
It would be very beneficial because he shows the overarching narrative of
all of Scripture.
Yeah. With that, we will sign off. Thanks for joining us again for another episode of Born to Read. We will catch you guys next time.
See ya.